Imagine meeting someone who has your exact full name, not similar, not close exact, and the moment you try to fix the mix-up, you feel something you were never prepared to feel. I always thought my name was simple ordinary, something I never really questioned because it felt like an anchor to who I was. But everything changed the day someone else started borrowing it, and by someone else, I mean a man. I had never met a man who somehow shared my full name. Exactly letter for letter, sound for sound, almost like life had printed a duplicate of me somewhere out there without permission. It began with small things, the kinds of things you blame on clerical errors. I received a bank message about a new credit card I never applied for, then an email confirming an appointment at a clinic I had never visited, then a parcel containing running shoes I definitely did not order. And at first I laughed about it, imagining some poor soul out there confused by receiving my grocery coupons or my online shopping returns. But the amusement faded quickly when I called the bank and the woman on the phone said politely, "Are you sure you didn't request this card, miss, because it was approved under your full registered name, date of birth, and initials?" And my heart paused for a second, because those details were too specific to be a coincidence. I checked again and again, convinced I had misread or misunderstood, but it was my name completely unchanged. I might have ignored it for longer, but then the hospital called me asking if I was coming for my follow-up, and I remember standing in the kitchen frozen, staring at the kettle as it boiled over, thinking what follow-up, who is using my name, and why does it feel like someone is living a second shadow version of my life? So I went to the municipal records office, ready to clear it all, only to hear the strangest sentence of my life. "Mom, this seems to be a simple identity overlap. It appears another person in the city shares your exact full name. It happens sometimes. Nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about. That was very easy for them to say, because that night as I lay in bed scrolling through old messages, I kept imagining him somewhere, someone with my name trailing behind him like an echo. What did he look like? Was he older? Younger? Did he hate the confusion too? Or was he the reason behind it? Days passed with more mix-ups, more cross deliveries, more wrong calls, and then one afternoon I received a handwritten letter, addressed to me only. It was clearly meant for him, a beautifully penned note from someone thanking him for a kindness he had done, and something inside me tightened, because the words felt warm, almost familiar, almost like they described a person I should know. And that was the day I realized I wanted to meet him. Not just to fix the mix-ups, but because some strange part of me needed to know the man who carried my name. Would you be curious, fearless, or terrified if someone out there shared your exact full name? I did not expect meeting him to become something I thought about every hour, but once the idea entered my mind, it settled inside me like a quiet rhythm, something steady, undeniable, impossible to ignore. I found myself imagining every version of him, tall, short, serious, funny, gentle, impatient, each possibility forming a fuzzy outline of a stranger who somehow felt connected to me in a way I could not explain. But wanting to meet him was one thing. Actually finding him was another, because I did not have his number, or his address, or his face, only his name. And the trail of our crossed lives. A trail made of wrong deliveries, mixed appointments, and confused officials. The universe, however, decided to make things easier. One morning, while leaving my apartment, I almost tripped over a small brown package sitting neatly outside my door. Not unusual, because deliveries had been arriving for weeks, but this one was different. The handwriting on it was elegant, careful, and full of curves, like each letter had been carved with affection. It was addressed to me, except not really because the name was mine, but the content inside was definitely not for me. When I opened it, I found an antique fountain pen wrapped in soft tissue, along with a short note. "Thank you for always listening. I hope this reminds you to never stop writing." The words made no sense to me. I was not a writer, and I certainly had not listened to anyone recently, but the message felt warm, almost personal, almost like reading a conversation someone else was having through my name. And then I noticed something else. The return address, written in tiny, neat handwriting, a quiet street near the old side of the city, a place filled with vintage shops, dusty bookstores, and houses that held too many memories. My heartbeat jumped, because for the first time I had something real, something belonging to him, something that led directly to the person who shared my name. I spent the entire afternoon debating with myself, should I go or leave it? Should I call the address label number written faintly at the bottom, or pretend I never saw it? Should I just drop the package at the postal service and walk away from whatever destiny was trying to script for me? But every time I tried to ignore it, my mind returned to the note. "Thank you for always listening." It felt too gentle, too sincere, too beautiful to be lost to the wrong person. So the next morning I went to find him, my stomach tight with nerves, the package tucked safely in my bag, the winter air crisp against my cheeks. I kept rehearsing what I would say in my head. "Hi, I think you have my name." Or maybe the universe is confused too. Or even something simpler like, "This is yours." When I reached the street, I paused for a long moment, staring at the row of weathered buildings, sunlight bouncing softly on old windows. It felt like stepping into the first page of a story I did not know I was meant to tell. I walked toward the address, slowly each step, a tug between fear and curiosity, wondering what kind of man waited behind that door, and why a stranger with my name already felt like someone who belonged to the important part of my life. Would you knock on the door, or walk away and pretend destiny had nothing to do with it? The door creaked softly when I finally knocked, and I almost turned around thinking maybe I had imagined all of this, but then it opened, and there he was, the man whose name matched mine. Exactly a stranger with kind eyes and a cautious smile, who looked at me as if he had been waiting for someone like me without knowing it. He was taller than I expected, slightly untidy, in a way that made him seem real and approachable. And for a moment, I just stared at him, forgetting every line I had rehearsed, forgetting the words I wanted to say, because it was impossible to look at him and not feel that strange pull, like our names had carried us to this moment across years of crossed paths. I think this is yours," I said finally, holding out the package, and his eyes widened in recognition. the smile faltering just slightly as if he wasn't sure whether to laugh or apologize or hide behind some invisible shield. My package? He asked quietly, like the words themselves were delicate, fragile things. And when I nodded, he took a careful step forward, taking it from me and holding it with both hands as if it weighed more than paper and tissue, like it contained a piece of fate he was afraid to break. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, neither of us speaking, just breathing in the strange gravity of coincidence and inevitability. And I realized something important that I hadn't expected. Meeting him was not about curiosity anymore. It was about presence. It was about the space that opened up the instant we were in the same room, about names. No longer being letters on paper, but a living connection between two people who didn't know how much they needed each other until now. I suppose we should sit inside, he said finally, motioning toward the small living room behind him, and I nodded, feeling like a child, stepping into a new world, one that had been waiting patiently for me without my knowing. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, and something else that I couldn't name, something comforting, familiar, and we sat across from each other, the package between us like a bridge, and I studied him silently, noting the soft curve of his lips, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the box, as if he wanted to tell me something, but didn't know how to start. I never expected anyone else to have my name, he said after a pause, and I laughed softly, even though the sound felt like trembling. I never thought someone else would live part of my life by mistake either, I replied, and he nodded slowly, as if those words were both confession and acknowledgement. And then something shifted. We began to talk slowly, cautiously, first about the mix-ups, the letters, the deliveries, the messages meant for the wrong person, and then about small things, the city, the weather, the books we liked, and I noticed the conversation flowing like a river that had been dammed for years until the moment we met, and suddenly everything was moving in a way that felt natural, inevitable. For the first time in weeks, months, maybe years, I felt like my name had finally found its mirror, a reflection that understood its weight, its quirks, its strange, unexpected life, and it was terrifying and beautiful all at once. Would you be able to talk so easily with someone who shares your exact name, or would the strangeness make you freeze? Days passed after that first meeting, and we started seeing each other more often, not because we planned it carefully, but because our lives kept pulling us together. Every wrong email, every misdirected package, every accidental phone call became an excuse, a small reason to meet and talk, and somehow those small meetings became the threads of a growing connection that neither of us had expected. We discovered little coincidences that felt too specific to be random. We both loved the same obscure coffee shop tucked behind the old cinema. We both read the same novels at the same pace. We both noticed the same tiny details in the city, like fallen leaves lining the street perfectly, or the way the morning light hit the windows of our favorite bookstore, and it felt like living inside a story, written for two people who had been waiting for each other without knowing it. I found myself laughing at his jokes in a way that surprised me. The sound soft and real because it wasn't forced, it was a reaction to him. Not the situation, not the coincidence, not the curiosity. It was just him and me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt warmth, like a quiet ember, glowing steadily inside my chest. Sometimes he would look at me and smile, and I could see the confusion in his eyes, like he didn't understand why he felt drawn to someone who simply shared his name. But I saw it too in myself, the way my heart leapt when he walked into a room, the way I noticed the tilt of his head, the gentle weight of his voice, and I wondered if he realized that our connection was no longer about a name at all. One rainy afternoon, we found ourselves trapped in a small cafe because the storm had arrived faster than we expected, and the windows fogged up as the rain poured down, and we sat across from each other, nursing steaming cups of tea and laughing about our past mix-ups, and suddenly the air between us shifted. He leaned forward slightly and said softly, "I think I've been waiting to meet someone like you for longer than I knew." And I felt my chest tighten because I knew exactly what he meant, without him needing to say more, and I whispered, "I think me too." And the words felt both fragile and eternal. From that moment, our conversations deepened. We spoke about dreams, fears, family, the tiny moments that shaped us, and slowly, without realizing it, our lives began to overlap in ways that extended beyond letters and packages, beyond names and coincidences. It became about being present, noticing each other, supporting each other, sharing pieces of life that had felt incomplete until the other arrived. And in those moments, I started to understand that meeting someone who shared my name was only the surface. The name was the spark, the bridge, the pretext. But the real connection, the one that made my heart race and my thoughts linger long after we parted, was something deeper, something neither of us had expected. And it terrified me because it felt too real, too powerful, too alive. Would you risk letting yourself feel something deep and real with someone who started as a stranger sharing your name? By the time we had known each other for a few months, I realized our lives were becoming tangled in ways neither of us had planned. And it was no longer about emails or packages or the strange coincidence of sharing a name. It was about laughter that lingered in my chest, about quiet afternoons spent in cafes, about the way he remembered things I had said once months ago, as if he had been storing every detail in a part of himself, reserved only for me. One evening, he invited me to his apartment, a small, cozy space filled with books, plants, and little notes pinned to the walls like a private map of thoughts and memories. And I walked in feeling like I was stepping inside a part of his mind, a place carefully curated yet warm and welcoming, and I understood then why the mix-ups had been only the surface. The name had drawn us together, but this space, this life, this person he was showing me now was what mattered. We sat on the floor, surrounded by stacks of books, sipping wine, and he told me about the way our name had caused confusion at his office, how colleagues had mistaken him for me repeatedly, and the embarrassment, the amusement, the odd sense of intimacy it had created. And I laughed because I had my own stories of wrong deliveries and misdirected letters, and somehow in sharing these small absurdities, we were building trust, a foundation that felt invisible, yet undeniable. As the evening wore on, he reached for a notebook, a small leather-bound journal, and opened it carefully. I noticed my name written there over and over, surrounded by little doodles, thoughts, reflections, questions he had apparently kept to himself for months, and I felt a rush of something warm and frightening all at once because I realized how much of himself he had entrusted even to the name that belonged to me. He looked up at me shyly and whispered, I started writing it for myself, but then it became about you, and I felt my chest tighten because I knew exactly what he meant. The words were simple yet full of a weight that had grown over time, a weight that now included both of us, a strange bond built of coincidence and choice and the soft revelation of a heart learning to trust. We sat there for hours, talking about everything and nothing, letting the night stretch around us like a promise, and I noticed how natural it felt to be with him, how ordinary and extraordinary it was, at the same time how sharing a name had led to sharing moments that mattered, and how impossible it now felt to imagine my life without these overlaps, without the strange gravity of his presence. By the time I left his apartment, the streets were quiet and wet from a light drizzle, and I walked home with a fluttering chest and thoughts spinning around our name, our lives, our laughter, and the strange new intimacy that had bloomed from a mix-up that seemed, at first, trivial and inconvenient. I realized then that sharing a name was no longer the story it had been before. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, far more human, far more beautiful than either of us had expected. Whose side are you on right now? Hers or his? Over the next few weeks, our connection deepened in ways that surprised me because I thought I understood what it meant to know someone, to feel close to someone, to care about someone, but with him it was different. It was like discovering a hidden room inside my own heart, a space I had not known existed, until he arrived and filled it with attention, laughter, and quiet understanding. We began meeting regularly, not out of obligation or habit, but because we wanted to share moments, because the city felt brighter when he was near, because even the small things like choosing a book or walking through the park felt richer together, and I noticed how effortlessly our lives began overlapping, not just through mix-ups, but through intentionality choices made almost unconsciously that pulled us closer. One rainy evening, we found ourselves at a small bookstore tucked into a side street, its windows fogged with warmth, and inside the air smelled of paper, ink, and coffee, and he pulled a copy of a novel from the shelf and handed it to me with a smile, saying, I thought you might like this, and I laughed softly because it was exactly the book I had been wanting to read, and yet he had no way of knowing. I realized then that he paid attention to details the world considered small, and in those details, he had been silently weaving himself into my life. After that, he walked me home under the drizzle, and we talked about everything and nothing. The city lights reflecting on wet pavements, the muffled sound of distant traffic, the occasional laugh of someone passing by, and I felt my heart unfold in ways I did not expect, because being near him was both calming and electrifying, a contradiction that made every step feel both familiar and new. At my doorstep, we paused, and I noticed the way he hesitated, as if wanting to say something, but unsure how to frame it. And I realized we had reached a point where the coincidences no longer mattered, where our shared name had become the symbol of something deeper, something neither of us had named. Yet, I like spending time with you, he said finally, voice soft, almost tentative, and I felt my chest tighten because it was simple, honest, and powerful all at once. I like spending time with you too, I whispered, and the words felt like a confession and a promise and a question all at the same time, because I did not know what would come next, but I wanted it to continue. I wanted us to keep discovering each other in the ordinary moments that had become extraordinary. We lingered there for a moment longer, then parted slowly with a wave and a smile, and I walked inside my apartment, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the heating, and everything to do with him, and the strange, unpredictable gift of sharing a name that had led to this fragile, beautiful connection. And as I lay in bed that night, replaying our conversation, I realized that it wasn't just about having the same name anymore. It was about the way our lives were entwining, the way two strangers had become something essential to each other, almost without noticing it. Do you think sharing a name means sharing fate? It was late afternoon when I got the call from him, his voice hesitant, soft, as if he wasn't sure how I would react. But I felt a flutter of anticipation, because after months of mix-ups and chance encounters, this felt different, like a chapter turning with intention. I found something, he said quietly, and I could hear the excitement lurking beneath the careful calm, and I asked what, and he hesitated a moment before saying, a letter meant for you, or me. I'm not sure yet, but it's about our names. My curiosity shot through me like electricity, and I felt my pulse quicken as I followed him to a small cafe halfway across town. The streets were busy with people heading home, but I hardly noticed because the thought of seeing him again after a day spent wondering made every step lighter. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a corner table, holding an envelope in his hands, his eyes lighting up briefly when he saw me, and I smiled softly, feeling that familiar pull, the one that had begun the day we first met through letters, parcels, and clerical errors. We sat down, and he placed the envelope gently between us, and I reached for it almost instinctively, my fingers brushing his for a split second, and I felt a jolt, a warmth that traveled up my arm, as if the universe had timed this moment perfectly for us. He unfolded the letter slowly and handed it to me carefully, like it was fragile and important, and when I read it, my breath caught because it was from someone neither of us knew, a friend, a stranger, an official acknowledging the confusion of two people sharing the exact same name, and yet within the words there was a thread of intimacy, of recognition, as if they had observed our lives from afar and understood the strange connection forming between us. We looked at each other and laughed softly at the absurdity, at the beauty of it, because even strangers had noticed the way our names were binding us together in ways neither of us had anticipated, and I realized in that moment how much he had become a part of my life without either of us realizing it. He reached across the table and brushed a strand of hair from my face, his fingers lingering briefly, and I felt the tension between us shift. It was no longer just curiosity, it was care. It was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable, and I noticed the way my chest felt lighter yet fuller at the same time. For hours we stayed in the cafe, talking about our names, our lives, the coincidences that led us here, and I noticed how natural it felt to be with him, how ordinary and extraordinary it was at the same time, and I began to understand that the mix-ups, the letters, the packages had been more than mistakes. They had been a roadmap leading us to this fragile, beautiful connection. And when we finally stepped out into the evening air, the city lights reflecting on wet pavements, I felt a certainty I hadn't allowed myself to feel before, that our lives were intertwined, that our names had brought us together, but what kept us there was something far more human, far more tender than a simple coincidence. Did he reveal the truth, or is he hiding something? The days after the cafe meeting felt like living inside a soft rhythm. I kept thinking about him constantly, about the way his eyes lit up when he found the letter, about the way our fingers had brushed when we reached for it, about the strange intimacy that had grown from our shared name and the small coincidences that had led us here. We began spending more time together deliberately, not just because of mix-ups, but because we wanted it. Because suddenly our lives had more color when we were together, because ordinary things like walking through the park, buying groceries, or waiting in line at the bookstore became shared experiences, and I noticed how the smallest gestures of his presence made my chest tighten in a way that felt tender and unfamiliar. One afternoon, we wandered into a little antique shop tucked into a side street. He was holding my hand as we explored the shelves lined with glass bottles, old letters, and tiny trinkets, and I noticed the way he paused over certain items, the care with which he examined things, the quiet fascination in his eyes, and I realized that he was noticing the world in a way I had never seen anyone notice it before, and somehow I felt seen too. We found a small music box, and he handed it to me with a shy smile, saying it reminded him of something he wanted to share. And when I opened it, soft notes played, and I felt my heart swell, because it was as if the melody itself carried our story, the beginning of something delicate and real, unfolding between us. And I knew then that sharing a name had been only the first step, the first spark of a connection that was growing into something far more intimate than either of us had expected. As the days turned into weeks, our conversations deepened. We spoke about fears, dreams, childhood memories, the silly things that had shaped us into who we were, and I noticed how natural it felt to confide in him, how easily my walls came down, how the name we shared had become less about coincidence and more about the bridge it created between two people discovering each other. One evening as the sun set and the city glowed golden, he turned to me quietly. I don't want this to be just coincidence anymore. And I felt my chest tighten because I knew exactly what he meant, and I whispered softly, me neither, and suddenly everything felt suspended, like the world had narrowed to the space between us, the quiet pulse of our hearts and the unspoken understanding that something beautiful was blooming. Walking home later that night, I replayed the moments in my mind, the touch of his hand, the melody of the music box, the laughter, the shared stories, and I realized that our lives were no longer just overlapping by accident. They were intentionally converging, guided by something deeper, something we could not see but could feel in every word, every gesture, every glance. And in that soft quiet of night, I felt an unfamiliar yet comforting certainty that our shared name had been only the beginning, that we had crossed into something that neither of us wanted to leave behind. How would you feel if your life kept crossing paths with someone in ways that felt inevitable? It was late at night when he called me, his voice quiet, almost hesitant, and I felt a thrill of anticipation because by now even the smallest contact from him made my heart leap, and I realized how much our lives had begun revolving around each other without either of us noticing. I have something I need to tell you, he said softly, and I could hear the weight behind the words, a mixture of excitement, nervousness, and something unspoken, and I held my breath, imagining all the possibilities, the confessions, the truths, the hidden parts of himself he might finally reveal. We met at our usual cafe, the one tucked away from the busy streets, the one where we had spent hours talking, laughing, sharing stories. And I noticed immediately the way he seemed smaller, somehow more vulnerable, his eyes searching mine for a reaction as he slid into the seat across from me. I think our connection isn't just about the name anymore. You wish, he began. And I nodded slowly because I had felt the same for weeks, but hearing him voice it made it real fragile and yet undeniably powerful, and my chest tightened in that familiar fluttering way. He leaned forward and his fingers brushed mine over the table, just slightly, a casual gesture that carried more weight than words could convey. And he whispered, I've been scared of what this means, what I feel for you, because it's more than coincidence. It's more than chance. It's something that's growing, and I don't want to lose it before it has a chance to be real. I swallowed hard, feeling the warmth rise in my chest because every word he spoke echoed exactly what I had been feeling, but had been too afraid to name. Too afraid to risk, too afraid to admit aloud, and I whispered, I feel the same. And the simplicity of the words made the air between us shimmer like sunlight on water. We talked for hours that night, not about the letters, not about the packages, not about the mix-ups, but about us, about feelings, hopes, fears, dreams. And I noticed how natural it felt to share these parts of myself with him, how effortless it was to be open and honest, and how impossible it now seemed to imagine a life without him in it. At some point, he reached for his notebook, the one he had shown me months ago, and handed it over carefully, and I opened it to find pages filled with reflections, thoughts, doodles, little confessions, and notes, all of them tied to the fact that our names had intersected, but more importantly to the fact that we had intersected in life in a way that mattered. Sitting there across from him, reading those words, I realized fully that our lives were entwined, not just by chance, but by choice, by attention, by care, by the deliberate way we had begun to notice each other, value each other, love each other without even needing to name it fully yet. When we finally left the cafe, the city was quiet, and lights reflected softly on the wet pavement, and I felt something I hadn't expected: relief, warmth, anticipation, and a soft certainty that this was only the beginning, that our shared name had led us to this moment. But what kept us together now was far more human, far more tender than any coincidence could ever be, whose heart is falling faster, hers or his. By the time we reached that small park near the river, I realized that everything had changed. Not just our routines, not just the coincidences that had brought us together, but the way I thought about him, the way my heart responded to his presence, and the quiet certainty that had been growing inside me for weeks. He stopped walking and looked at me, his eyes searching mine for something I could not name yet. I understood it immediately. It was trust. It was vulnerability. It was a hope that our connection could be more than letters, packages, mix-ups, more than accidental meetings. It was an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed quietly between us. I've been thinking about this a lot, he said softly, and I felt my chest tighten because I knew what was coming, even before the words left his lips. Our names brought us together, but I don't want that to be all we have. I want to see where this goes. I want to see what happens if we choose to be more than coincidence, more than strangers who share a name. I swallowed hard because it felt like the culmination of months of anticipation, longing, and curiosity, and I whispered, I want that too. And in that instant, the world seemed to narrow to the space between us, the gentle sway of the trees, the soft murmur of the river, and the steady rhythm of our hearts matching in a way that had nothing to do with chance and everything to do with choice. We sat on the bench watching the water shimmer, with the reflection of city lights talking quietly about dreams, hopes, fears, the tiny details that had made us who we were, and the small ways we had begun noticing each other that had made a life together possible, even before we had admitted it to ourselves. And I realized that what had started as a strange twist of fate sharing a name had become something entirely ours, something deliberate and real. He reached over and took my hand in his, and I felt the warmth spread through me, a simple gesture full of meaning, the kind that words could never capture. And I realized that our names were no longer the story. They were the beginning, the spark, the first bridge that had led us to the heart of each other. And now what mattered was everything beyond that. The life we could create, the moments we could share, the laughter, the quiet evenings, the gentle intimacy of being known fully. As we walked home slowly, hand in hand, I thought about the path that had led us here, the packages, the letters, the mix-ups, the small coincidences, and I smiled softly because sometimes life uses something as simple as a name to guide you to someone who matters, to someone who feels like home without ever telling you it was coming. And standing outside my door, I turned to him and whispered softly, I guess sharing a name isn't so strange after all. And he smiled that gentle, warm smile that had drawn me in from the very first meeting and replied, not when it leads to this. And I knew that he was right, because what mattered was not the letters, not the coincidences, not the mix-ups, but the choice to stay, to notice, to care, to share a life together, a life that had begun with a name, but had grown into something infinitely bigger, infinitely warmer, infinitely ours. Should two people with the same name end up together?